All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, creatives and artists from around the world tuning in online. Hello, I'm here at the Maxon booth at NAB NYC 2023, showcasing Cinema 4D and the rest of Maxon 1 and all the amazing tools that we have here. So things are we're about to turn up the heat, folks. Y'all ready for this? Yeah, you are. All right, we're about to turn up the heat with Nasir Barday. Woo!
Can you guys hear me okay? Thank you. Oh. How's that? Oh, here, I can hear myself. Cool. Hi, everybody. We excited to play with fire today? So what I wanted to do with this one is, I know we're showing a lot of polished work today, but this presentation is going to be more about experimentations with Pyro and what I've learned playing with it in the last 6 or so weeks. First, a little bit about me. I'm a UX designer at Bloomberg, so I work on software that runs the financial world, but I also, in my off time, work in 3D, concert visuals, stage design. This is a little bit of my work. This is an aerial dancer working on one of my stage designs. You can see LED panels, some like pixels running through. This is an art festival that took place in Lisbon in 2018. The next version of which we are going to do in Dubai this coming summer. So we're really excited to see some of that come to fruition. But let's get back to Pyro, shall we? So I just wanted to show you guys a few of the experimentations we're going to walk through today. And I just wanted to start off by talking about volumetrics. And Pyro, as you know, is driven by a technology called OpenVDB. Does anybody know what OpenVDB is? Have you guys seen any of this stuff? I think this is pretty blasé. But I don't know if you realize that Margot Robbie at some point explained OpenVDB. This is her introducing the Oscar for the technical Oscar for the technology.
Who wants to hear more about volumetric data? Yeah! Miles does.
I love it.
You love that volumetric
My favorite kind of data.
I thought it was. So that might be the case. Well, now that everyone can access the voxels and work with them, a team at DreamWorks Animation created an OpenVDB. OpenVDB is, I'm sorry.
It's so funny, Margot. It's just the name of the software.
I don't know why it sounds so sexual to me.
Get it together.
This is so immature. OpenVDB is available as open source. OpenVDB is available as open source software and provides a powerful tool set to process.
See, that's funny to me.
And manipulate the voxels, okay? Manipulate the voxels.
It's all about the voxels. Nice.
There's just something about Margot Robbie saying the words OpenVDB, volumetric data, voxels, and thinking it's something sexual. I don't know, there was something that does things for me there. That's funny. So what I wanted to start off with is just a couple of the basic steps. For those of you who have not done Pyro in Cinema 4D before, I realized I'd built a whole presentation going into all the details, but I didn't actually have something about setting something on fire in Cinema 4D. So this is what it looks like just from the get-go. If you throw a cube into a scene, and you right-click on that cube to add a pyro emitter, it gives you everything that you need to just start playing that in your viewport. What you also need is a rendering object. So you need a pyro object so Redshift knows what to look at. So first we turn on the channels for density and temperature, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the next thing you need to do is to create a material. So this is me kind of going off into the Redshift land. And the video is stalling. Nope, I think that's all we got. So sorry about that. But basically what ends up happening is you get a cube that sets itself on fire, and it's all in the defaults, and it just looks like it's blowing up. And what I wanted to get into, and the reason I brought up volumetric data, is that all Pyro is an engine that creates OpenVDB data, okay? And the fire itself is just this temperature channel within that OpenVDB data. You also have density, what it calls density, which we kind of know as smoke commonly. And what that engine does is it goes and creates temperature, it creates density, and just puts that into a simulation. So it knows what fire is supposed to do once it's there, it knows what smoke is supposed to do, and it does a couple of different things which we'll go into. But ultimately, all the Pyro engine is doing is creating volumetric data and animating it, and simulating how it works in real time, and you see the 3D pixels that are kind of being created. I think it's important to think about it this way, because if you look at, there's actually a really great overview that Maxon has done for about 3 hours. And Athanasios Pozantzis, also commonly known as Noseman, at the end of that feature on YouTube, I'll show a link to that toward the end. He says it's an evolving volumetric system that advects volume grids. I think he was being tongue-in-cheek to be super technical about it, but that's all it is. So it's not just about fire. It's about actually creating volumetric data and manipulating it in different ways. And so I'll first start off with what kicked off my whole fascination with Pyro was this Instagram post. Let's check it out. Afterburners on a Mustang. And I don't know, there's so many things that do things for me here. There's like obviously a sports car and fire coming out of the back of it. Nobody ever sees this. Actually, if you look at the guy's posts, it's all posts of people just asking him to fire it up. So I wanted to start with this, so we'll go a little bit more traditional fire and smoothing it out, and then we'll go into some other ways that we can use the Pyro engine. So I was looking at, how would I do something like that in the 3D world? And the first thing you want to look at are different types of flames. So this is just a Google image search that I did for butane flames. And I just wanted to see, what do the actual flames look like in real life? So what really resonated with me, I can't show my cursor here, was this third to last flame that's super smooth, it's bright, and straight on. The other ones kind of have a little bit more variance going on. They look a little bit more like a match flame. But I wanted something that was kind of more straight and true. And then I picked a model off of, I believe this is off of Sketchfab. I've got the URL here. It's just a free model that I downloaded. This is the McLaren F1. It comes from Need for Speed. So I put that in. I wanted something, very quick to be able to get to a result and throw afterburners on and be able to see what came out of that. So I did a couple of tests, and what I found was to actually get, I did a couple of tests here, and you see off to the right, I've got a disc. What I was trying to do was, if you look at the back of the exhaust here, oh, here we go. If I was just to select the geometry on the back of this and just make a disc out of the exhaust port, that's what I was simulating off to the right over here, this rightmost object. And that wasn't quite working. What I had to do was create a cylinder as if it was a real piece of thermodynamic machinery. Because the engine actually needed, but this is my theory anyway, is the engine actually needs to know what to push through. And if it's just putting it on the top of a disk, all it's doing is setting it on fire. But if we want a jet flame, you need an actual tube for all of that pyro to go through. So what I found was, in just doing a bunch of, this actually took me a whole week of just playing around. Why isn't this disk working? And I had to go offline, outside of the scene entirely, and I figured out that you had to use these cylinders to get this really smooth flame. And this is kind of what one of the tests came out as. Now, you kind of notice, I'm going to play this again, you kind of have to wait for the flame to grow. And if you don't want to wait for that, there's a set initial state button, which I'll show you in a second, so that it just immediately lights up. And I'll show you how that plays out in the scene. But, the first thing that I wanted to do was, how do you even get a straight flame to begin with? And the simulation has to actually go through and calculate from the beginning, from lighting it up inside the tube and lighting the fuel inside. It has to grow it out. But you can actually get the simulation to start, say, right here, and that can kind of immediately turn on the afterburners in your scene. So this is the offline testing that happened. And then I think I was actually trying to show you guys how to right-click and reveal the simulation tag. I kind of went into that earlier. But the way this scene is structured is you've got these two cylinders, and this cursor likes to show up and doesn't like to show up sometimes. I'm not sure what's happening. So I'm going to wave my hands and try to be descriptive. So on the left-hand screenshot, you have these two cylinders. And I'll show you in a second about the simulation scene. Let's not get into the details of that just now. But then you have the Pyro output object, which is under that scene. I've also got another test one, and then just a simple light. That's kind of what was driving the scene that I showed you earlier. And off on the Pyro emitter settings, one of the important aspects to get this to work is having a lot of temperature to work with. Temperature is an analog for fire, right? Whenever we see temperature, we actually mean fire. And we just need a lot of it. So I've set that at 6,000. I think it defaults to something like 1,000, so that's cranked all the way up. Another thing that makes this work is velocity. So not only do you need stuff that's burning and super hot, but you need speed that's running through that tube. And I cranked that up. And if you notice here, there's 3 numbers for direction. That's just a vector. That's your X, Y, and Z, for those who aren't familiar with how that works. And the Z direction, the depth direction is where I wanted the flame to kind of come out. The other thing that happens is in the Pyro output object. So I told you about all those things that get created for free. When you right-click on something, say Pyro emitter, it goes and creates a Pyro output object for you. And then there's a whole other set of settings in the Pyro object. The Pyro output object. One of the most important ones is velocity smoothing, which actually in this screenshot you see it's at 0. I'd actually cranked that to 100% to make that flame look like it was straight, tried, and true. There was also temperature smoothing. So between both of those, you get a very straight flame. And then that's what yields this result here. And then we bring that into the scene. There's a couple other experimentations that I did. So, I talked about speed versus temperature. If you have too little temperature, you start getting little sputters. So if you look at the Instagram post, here, let me bring it back up again. I'm sorry if it's loud. You notice how it kind of puffs out? It kind of snuffs out at the end there. That's actually because, well, if we bring it into the 3D world, there's too much velocity going for the amount of temperature that's in there. And in real life, we're talking about speed and pressure, which is your velocity, and the fire. So if there's not enough fire behind the speed that we're pushing through, and over here I've kind of overdone it. You see off to the left, the velocity strength is something like 30,000. And you see this tube on the left, which is matching to that one. It's kind of sputtering out because there's way too much. So as you're playing with the engine, you want to make sure that you're balancing how much flame you have versus how much speed you have or velocity. There's another experiment that I did here. So in the Pyro volume that you add to the Pyro object to just get the flame to work, this can be very confusing at first. And I actually spent this is probably another couple of days worth of experimentation where I was trying to figure out what was actually going on with this stuff on the right. Who's actually seen this screen before or played with this already? Just trying to figure out what level of familiarity I have. Okay, just a little bit of experimentation. So what's different about the material tag? So by the way, you have to go into the menus and just create a Pyro volume in the menus, which I can show a little bit later if anybody needs a walkthrough of that. But once you look at this, you're still kind of left with, well, where's my temperature? Where's my smoke? Where's my fire? The things that I'm familiar with. Well, you just have to do a little bit of a mapping of the terminology. So scatter and absorption are the places where smoke gets rendered. So scatter is just showing how much light is getting reflected back to the camera, and absorption is kind of keying off of that same channel. So you can pick a channel for the scatter, which is the density that's coming off of the object. This comes in by default, by the way. Absorption is what the shadows are. So if you think of ambient occlusion, that's kind of the better analogy for it. But between scatter, that controls your brightness. Absorption controls the darkness. So when you look at a smoke cloud, you see parts that are bright, parts that are dark. That's what's controlling those things. So if you see scatter and absorption, those together are controlling what's happening with density. And they try to be helpful by just defaulting density into that channel. The other default is emission gets temperature. So I think because this thing is trying to be a little bit more generic, this is a volume renderer, not necessarily a Pyro renderer, we're trying to map the things that are coming off of that OpenVDB data that's come out. So I told you before, let me go back to this diagram. right? The data that's getting generated is density and temperature. And we need to tell the renderer what channels to plug that into when it's going in and creating light, because the renderer doesn't know about fire, doesn't know about that types of data. The Pyro object has gone and generated density and temperature, but now we have to tell the renderer what channels does it actually have to go into in the renderer. So if we go back to this, we're seeing that pushed into, when we talk about density, which is the smoke, that has to go into telling the renderer, scatter light this way, absorb light this way, and that's your smoke. And in the emission channel, that's the brightness part. So when what we think of as fire needs to be rendered as something that generates light within the scene. So then that takes the temperature bit. But you can actually flip these around and get some other experimentations. So this is actually taking temperature and putting it into the density channel. Now, if you go into the overview that Maxon gives for this, there's a couple other experimentations that they do where they actually run this backwards. But there's some cool effects that you can get by just taking what is effectively an explosive or super energetic field, putting it into smoke, and you get other kinds of effects here. So just more tools as you guys are playing on your own with the Pyro engine of how you can kind of change the looks around. Something else I wanted to illustrate here is I've kind of shown a couple of different objects here, right? And I just wanted to show the hierarchy, because this took me a little bit of time to understand. So when you look at any Pyro scene, you start with your 3D object. So that's, say, your cube, for example. And then I showed you guys adding the Pyro emitter tag to that particular object. So every object gets some sort of a Pyro emitter tag. Now you can have multiple Pyro emitter tags within one Pyro object. Now what's a little confusing is that the Pyro object has its own set of settings. The Pyro emitter has its own set of settings. And as we go through this deck, I'll show you guys where those different settings live. But ultimately, the Pyro object controls what is the actual simulation doing? What is the environment within which everything works? So things like smoothing, other things that involve the properties of how flames are treated goes into the Pyro object. Normally, you can only have one Pyro object in any given Cinema 4D file. If you want a couple of different types of flames, which I'll show some ways to combine this a little bit later, but if you want to combine different types of effects together, and you want to have different types of Pyro objects with different settings, each of those needs to go into its own simulation scene. So then a simulation scene is a way to give you kind of a safe space for your Pyro object, and then the Pyro emitter can kind of live within that. So that's a little bit of the theory. I don't want to glaze your eyes over too much with just looking abstract. Let's start looking at some screenshots. So I showed you guys the Pyro object and the Pyro emitter settings before. Now we can add a simulation scene, and it kind of has similar, it actually takes a lot of those same objects, those same settings from Pyro and embeds it within itself. So now you can create multiple simulation scenes. Each of those gets a Pyro object. So you get this create output object button within there. What's interesting about this simulation scene is you actually want to create this Pyro output object because you want to play with, if you want to play with caches, you need to be able to do that on the object itself. But if you don't want to do that initially, the simulation scene just kind of gives you Pyro settings for free that you can kind of start tweaking with. And then within that, you have these different categories of settings. I think the most important ones are extra forces, which involve your smoothing, how to treat density and temperature is what we're going to be playing with today. And so within that one simulation scene, you can create your looks, and then you can combine a whole bunch of those within a file. So as we get into practice for the Afterburner, I'll show you guys how this worked in the file. So I think I showed you guys a little bit earlier about how the Pyro output object has its own treatments off to the right. So with density, you have this property called dissipation, which is how much do things disappear over time. This happens for both temperature and density. And you can play with that. But again, if you want to have different looks, that has to be done in a different Pyro object, which needs to be in a different simulation scene. So what's being controlled off to the right here are the dissipation properties. Velocity itself has smoothing, which gets applied. All of those affect the look of your flame. And if you want a different kind of flame in the scene, we have to go and create another Pyro output object and just then play with it there. But within the scene, if you have multiple Pyro emitters, you can actually play with the amount of density that's getting pushed through. How much smoke, how much flame. You're free to play with that within that safe space of a simulation scene. So I'm just showing again here, right-clicking and adding a Pyro emitter. And here's how it ends up looking in the render. So what I ended up doing was taking that model, I took those cylinders that we saw earlier and just put them inside this model. And we're going to add a little bit more to this model in just a second, but now you can just see how it plays out in practice. Just running a simple animation, moving the model forward, and sticking those afterburners in there, and this is what came out of Redshift with playing with those settings. All right, the next thing I played with were motion trails. So this is a way to take smoke and have it work on an actual volume and run that over time. So I'll get to this in a second. This is maybe a little bit out of order. But here's a motion trail that comes off the bottom of a tire. So if you noticed in this render here, there's nothing really happening under the tires, right? You have this afterburner that's pushing this speed, but there's no burnout or anything that's happening under it. And what I wanted to do was play with the mist that would come off of the bottom of those tires. If we were on a flat surface and we were just taking the rubber that was just, or some water vapor that was kind of evaporating off of the back of it. So I wanted to play with how you might do that. So here's just a simple cube that I used as an emitter. Again, I've shown you a couple of times. You right-click on the thing, you add an emitter, and then you just play with the settings in the Pyro object and the emitter itself. And then if you crank up the settings for smoothing and velocity and for density, you get something like this that kind of zooms across and has that trail behind it. And this is a still frame for what it looks like. You can kind of get a nice misty effect. And this was exactly what I was looking for. So by just playing with a couple of the defaults and cranking up smoothing, cranking up speed, bringing that effectively 100% on all of these, you get an effect like that. And then in practice, oh, I don't think it's playing for me. But you can kind of see, I'm sorry, it's just a still frame, guys. But you can kind of see under the wheels where that mist is coming off of. I'll try and play that video file for you guys in a little bit to show how that works, if we have time at the end for questions. But basically now, in combination with the afterburners going off, you have some nice mist that's coming off of the bottom. And trust me, as it moves, there's a trail that comes off as it goes off into the distance. All right, so the next one is what I call the cloudy reveal. This is all kind of adding up to some sort of just a demo, like based on memes that you see in car commercials or traditional VFX. And the next idea I wanted to try was, how might I take the actual the car itself and have it look like it's appearing out of a cloud of smoke? And so in order to do that, I needed some sort of a cloud type of effect. So this is a little bit of a render of how that worked. If you run it backwards, you could see how that could look like. So this is basically the frames run backwards. But I have a rotation in here as well as some smoke simulation that's kind of creating this wispy reveal. And you could see how you could actually fade that into the actual model and it would look like a proper reveal. So here's how that worked in practice. One of the first things that you need is a volume builder to create the smoke off of. So in order to get the initial, if you look at this thing in forward time, it kind of starts with that frame, right, where you have the car itself, and that's kind of getting rotated and wisped around. If you look at it in forward time, it's basically starting off by creating those voxels in the shape of the car, and then a rotation object kind of just screws it up and makes it disappear. And I just ran that backwards. And so all that's happening now is I threw that same model into a volume builder and made that emit smoke. So you see again, I don't have my cursor here, but if you use your imaginations here, off to the left, I've got a vapor emitter on, a pyro emitter on the vapor emitter that I called it. So that thing is taking the McLaren F1 and turning it into a volume. And I scaled it down using a null. But ultimately, that emitter object creates the density that we're talking about. And then what I did was I created a shell for the thing because I didn't want it to lose too much of its dimension. So I did another one of those, but I created just a volume mesher around that, put it in X-ray mode for my viewport, and I turned that. If you see the little bricklaying icon off to the right, when you go into the simulation menu, you also have what's called a collider. And if you make that a collider within that system, it actually keeps the smoke within that shape and contained. So now what you get is smoke that's getting created. It works within the shell, so it goes poof, and then it stays within that kind of glass box. But we can keep that invisible just by turning off its visibility in the renderer. The other important thing when you work with an emitter like this is you want to make sure it's in fog mode. I had trouble at first with the defaults. I think it's just called assign distance field. That didn't quite do it for me because what I really do want is what you would intuitively think of as fog, not just like a shell of smoke, but I wanted it to actually come out as a big block of literal fog and that expanding out into the shell, and then all of that needed to get get turned into the tumbler of this rotation field. Something else that I want to note here is, as you're doing this work, you want to keep your files organized, right? And this simulation scene, if you see this vapor with that little atomic icon off to the left, that simulation scene there, I would normally put that under a null. We all use nulls to organize our files, right? But I found that when I put that simulation scene inside the null to keep it all in one place, it created a ghost image somewhere else in the file. So it's just a little gotcha. I think this will be probably an enhancement that goes into these future builds. But as of Cinema 4D 2024, if you try to put a simulation scene within the null to keep it all organized, you end up with like this ghost version of it off to the side. So I kept that out, and then I just named it the same to keep them the same. And if you see that rotation is outside here, that's actually a mistake. That should actually just be under the simulation scene to keep it all organized. For those of you who use xParticles, the xParticle system kind of has similar vibes to this, where you want to keep as many of your objects kind of organized within what is doing what, so then when you go back, and there's, as you can see, 100 different checkboxes where something can go wrong, you want to always be able to have a way to go back and be able to know where the different settings are. Okay, so that's the setup, and I can show you a couple of test renders in a second. The simulation scene I do want to delve into, as well as some of the settings on the Pyro emitter and the Pyro object. So the other important thing to remember with simulation scenes is that, by default, it has its own invisible simulation scene. Cinema 4D does. It just calls it the default simulation scene. But if you actually want it to have it interact with your simulation scene itself that you've created, you need to take all of those elements, the emitter, the collider that I mentioned, the rotation force that I talked about, all of that needs to be manually brought into this simulation scene. The other gotcha here is that you want to work with the Pyro output object that gets created by the simulation scene. This is a little nerdy and I know a little technical, but if you try to do it the other way and you realize, oh, I want to organize my file and I want to make sure that all of my Pyro effects, I can have multiple Pyro effects within this file. If you don't do this first, where you go and create the output object, you can see this little button off to the right. If you look at the rightmost screenshot toward the top, you see that create output object button. You want to make sure you're using that object that comes out and not the default one that gets created, because it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. So if you know ahead of time that you're going to create multiple different types of flames, mess around with fog and things, and I think inevitably as you play with this, you're going to want multiple effects. You actually saw in Harrison's presentation, I noticed there were at least 3 or 4 different types of Pyro simulations that he had going on in there. And there's no way that you can actually make that happen unless you have these Pyro objects created by the simulation scene and tweak those from there. It's kind of a pedantic thing, but it's more of a hygiene thing as you set up your scenes to create this. Now we can go into what's going on with the Pyro emitter and the Pyro output object. Now I'll repeat again. You can have multiple Pyro emitters, and so those settings within the Pyro emitter, you can have a bunch of different objects with this tag on it, and they will all work within that one simulation scene. And the things that you can set are things like the density. And here you see that I've set it to 1. The reason for that is because it is a fog volume. The Pyro engine already knows that it's a fog, and all it has to do is create those particles within that volume, and you're done. You don't have to do anything more. You don't have to create any more, add any more density or anything like that. We'll actually show what that looks like in a second when you actually up this add parameter. It actually creates trails. And in this case, all I wanted was like a little poof of smoke. So we just set that at 1. And there's another thing that has to happen here, which is you have to keyframe the enabled parameter here. And so you only want to have that happen for 1 or 2 frames and then have it wink out. So you want to make sure that you set a keyframe on this enabled thing. In this middle screenshot, you see that diamond's lit up. You want to make sure that 1 of those frames or 2 of those frames it's on, and then for the rest of it it's off. And I'll show you what happens if you leave it on. You end up getting trails, which can be desirable sometimes. But in this case, for this particular cloud reveal, combined with the rotation, you just want to have it set at 1. And then I've turned off temperature, and I've added velocity just to add a little bit of speed to the outer movement. In the output object, I've cranked up the smooth factor for temperature, and I think this might be an older screenshot. I actually should have the velocity cranked up as well. And again, since this is a Pyro output object, I can only do this once within a simulation scene. So if I want another kind of effect where something's a little bit less smooth, we add a little bit of turbulence, I have to create another simulation scene to make that happen. So that's an overview of the settings that are going into this to make this cloudy reveal work. I kind of want to just show you guys animations because I don't want to make your eyes glaze over too much. But this is just kind of playing around with different setups. And I was just playing, with simulations, you want to continue to iterate and play with how the effects are working. Off to the right, I was actually playing with what's called the object fidelity slider. And you see that on the tag itself. You see how it's cranked to 100% in this middle screenshot? That's what I did off to the right. And it doesn't look so great, staying really true to the geometry. And so I was playing with different ways to just to compare and contrast. Now to do this in your viewport, you want to use the caching feature. That's over here. So in the cache tab on that Pyro output object, you can see I just was generating cache after cache after cache after cache. And it's really easy to do. You just hit the cache scene and it goes and generates it. And what's really powerful about this is now I can toggle between the different scenarios. So as I'm playing with the output object, with the settings on the emitter, sometimes I might have things baked just how I like it, and I might realize, you know what, I went backwards on that one. I don't exactly want to recreate those settings. I just want to go back to that one, and boom, I'm good to go. This is a way to kind of have your own kind of undo list, but also to have a couple of scenarios. So let's say that you're playing with a couple of different scenarios and for a client, right? And so if I was trying to talk to the art director, about which ones of these actually make sense. The one off to the right stays true. Let's say we're talking to the McLaren brand, and for some reason they're doing a retrospective on the 1993 model of the McLaren F1. That art director might say they might conceivably want to stay true to the geometry off to the right, but you can easily see this doesn't quite look as good as this one on the left. So if we're trying to be pixel perfect, frame by frame, here's your scenario on to the right. And then if we want to do what we think it looks a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, here you have the one on the left. I could save those out as different caches, and that gets saved to disk. And very quickly, I can click the checkboxes to go back and forth between those. What's also interesting here, I don't know if I've got screenshots for this, but it bears to emphasize, in this last version, they added this up-res scene button, which is super cool. So as you know, Pyro takes a lot of computing power. So you can run at a lower resolution and kick out these caches, right? And see how it plays out. The minute you bring down the voxel size within a scene, it infinitely brings up your compute power, and it also affects the whole scene as a whole. And if all you want to do is add a little bit of fidelity to the output, you can use this up-res scene button. And instead of having to go and tweak everything, because the minute you bring the voxel size down, which increases the resolution, it makes the smoke that much more pleasing, but then you have to go elsewhere in the simulation and change settings to compensate for that. This up-res scene button in this new version just makes it super quick, just to see if I was to go through all of that hard work, what would that look like? So it's a super handy feature, and by the way, you can also use that to see, again, if you're running if you're moving forward or backwards in terms of how in terms of the creator direction for the scene. You can easily go back to the low res caches in that list. So that's using the cache tab and going through iterations. The next thing I want to talk about is the ghost trail. So the ghost trail is just taking that same emitter technique that I talked about and just running it in time. So if you were to continually leave density on or turn on the add flag, you get this trail that comes out. Now, this particular result is really just an experimentation. I think there's a lot that we can do, and I'll show you a little bit about how I evolved this. It's not as interesting on its own. I think I might have a, if you just do it on its own, you do kind of get this cool thing toward the end where the fog is kind of peeling off of the car. I think there is some more work to be done here. But what I wanted to prove to myself was, is this something that's possible? This was actually something I was doing while I was working on the cloud reveal, and I was learning about what happens when you turn on density and leave it on versus just keyframe it being on and off. So this is just leaving density on. And you can kind of see the structure of the scene here. Something interesting else that's, for those of you that are still starting out in C40, what's really useful is to put the camera in the same null. So if you can use a null to organize your scene, you can actually put the camera in that same grouping, and that camera will animate along with that null that moves along in that scene. So it's kind of an interesting technique to have if you're trying to do like a droney type of shot where you're following it along. I don't have a lot in the background here where texture is moving, but this is a nice dolly shot to follow along. And it's very easy to do just by throwing your camera into the null and focusing on that one. Otherwise, it's very similar things to what I just showed you. You've got the trail emitter, which is that volume emitter that I showed earlier. It's got the McLaren within it, and that's also set to, I believe that's set to a fog volume, and that's continuing to slough off smoke. I don't have that same shell as I did before because I'm not as concerned with keeping things within that volume builder shell. So now I've got the emitter, I have, and I just have all the basics that I would put into a scene. Something else that's interesting with this new release for 2024 is that all the Redshift objects are kind of your default objects. So we were talking earlier about how you might throw in a dome light. I think a couple of presentations have talked about that. If you don't even want to go through that effort, there's a really easy sky object that you can add to a scene just to quickly get an idea for how it's all coming together. You can quickly rotate that sun to be able to get an idea for how things would react. And you have a very quick rig available to you. You're just clicking the sky button, and you can get the whole scene lit. Because in this case, I'm just experimenting with the Pyro object, and in terms of those simulations, I'm not too focused on rendering. So very quickly, I'm able to get to a result, which is what Cinema 4D is so great at. So then the other thing that I started doing was adding wind to this. And what's interesting about the wind object, and actually Noseman goes over this in the overview of Pyro. By the way, that's a great 3-hour overview if you want to totally nerd out about simulations. I kind of wanted to pack those 3 hours into this, so you're kind of getting a lot of that high level stuff. But if you're really interested in playing with this, there's a whole series online of just 3 1-hour sessions that they've done. And Noseman actually talks about how he turns off turbulence and all those other forces that are built into the Pyro object. There are things that have kind of been put in there that I was showing you sliders for that get you to a quick result. You can actually start throwing in other forces. If you turn those off in the Pyro object, now you can start playing with wind and throw that in. So I've cranked up turbulence, I've cranked up the speed, and I didn't have time to kick out a whole render for you guys, but here's a viewport render of how that's working. So now you see that smoke, that quote-unquote smoke, which is basically fog, that was coming off of it, now has this super turbulent property. And you can see how with some more experimentation, you can play with different looks. So now you start to see how that smoke is starting to peel off of the car. And then the other thing that has to happen, just you have to remember to put that wind into that simulation scene. And I'm just showing off a few of the other settings that came off of the back of that setup. So here's another still frame from that. I think I'm running I'm running short too. Sorry, Matthias. But we can definitely take questions here. I was hoping to linger a little bit more and show you guys some more detail. But if you've got questions, let's get into those. I mentioned the series for the deep dive that they've done. I think this was last November. The Cinema 4D help file is also really great for diving into details.
Awesome. Let's give a big round of applause for Nasir.
Thanks, guys.
Now, did you do any smoke and fire before using Pyro, or
Actually,
only?
no.
So, yeah.
Turbulence FD was always on my list to explore. Explosion effects and X particles. Yep. It was always on my to-do list. But not to oversell the system too much, but I was able to show, very quickly you can get to a result in 30 seconds.
Yeah, just jumping in. Any questions for Nasir? Maria. Great question. So the question was, are the examples rendered in Redshift or the viewport? What do you have?
So this one is in Redshift. This one here is the viewport. Sorry, this is Redshift as well. This is viewport. Yeah, you can preview the results in the viewport, absolutely. And so you'll see like a lower fidelity version of it. Sometimes the render looks a little bit different from what's in the viewport. So if I go over here, over here you have like super nice long flames. When you get into the render itself, it doesn't always prove out that way. So there is a little bit of a delta. Like that same long yellow flame renders like this in Redshift. So sometimes you have to play with the materials. But yeah, in the viewport you get a good indication of what's going to happen.
Any other questions? All right, we'll be taking our next break, folks, but stay tuned because up next we have Ern Stern. Woo!
Well, thanks, everybody.